Hey guys, and welcome to part 2 of the React Up and Running series. In this lesson, we're going to take a close look at components, props, state, and lifecycle methods. Coming up. React applications are made up of components. A component is an independent, reusable section of the UI. So before starting on a new project, it's always a good idea to consider your vision for the final design and start to map out various sections of the UI into React components. So if we look at the AWS site, for example, there's a navbar at the top. So that's probably going to be one component. Now components can also be nested. So this orange button over to the right here, that's probably going to be another component nested inside of the nav component. Your slider or hero area, that's going to be another component. And then these informational blocks down below, those are going to be more components in your application. In part 1 of this series, we use the Create React App tool to generate a starter React application. We're going to use that now to start coding some basic components, so let's go ahead and open our code editors. All right, now in your project root, you should have a source folder, so let's go ahead and expand that and open up the app.js file. Now there are two basic kinds of components in React, functional components and class-based components. First, we're going to take a look at functional components. Now a functional component is essentially just a JavaScript function that returns a string, a number, a JSX element, which we'll talk about soon, or another React component. So as I mentioned earlier, components can be nested, and one component can actually output another component. In fact, this is how most applications are built, where we have the app root level component that contains a number of child components making up the UI. So let's start by coding a basic Hello World example component. Now the first thing I want to do is clean up our app.js a little bit. So we can go ahead and get rid of all of this example code under the div with class name app. So go ahead and delete that. I'm also going to delete these two imports of app.css and logo.svg. So go ahead and delete those and save app.js. All right, the next thing I want to do is to create a new folder under the source directory, and let's call it components. So this folder is going to hold all of our new components. Now let's create a new file inside of components and call it greeting.js. All right, now inside this file, we're going to code our first component. So let's do export, because we're exporting this so we can import it inside app.js later. Default, because it's the only export. Okay. Function greeting. Return, and let's just return a string, hello world. Okay, and let's go ahead and save that. Now, if you notice, this is just a basic JavaScript function, okay? And we're exporting this function so we can reference it in other files. All right, so let's head back over to app.js and import our new component. So I'm going to do import greeting from /components/greeting. Oops. Now, notice I don't need to specify the .js file extension because it implicitly knows what to look for. All right. So now, under our div with class name app, if you go on the next line there, we can import our component. So greeting with a self-closing tag. Now this basically is referencing this import here from our component file. And one thing to take note of is the capitalization of our React component. Now all React components need to start with a capital letter, and that is just to tell React, hey, this is a React component and not just a regular DOM element. Okay? So go ahead and save that. Now open up your command line interface if you've closed it. Looks like mine is compiled already, so if we open up a browser, let's check and see if our component is working. Here we go, localhost 3000, and there is our hello world string. All right, so far so good. So of course in most real world applications we won't want to just render a string but some kind of HTML block to the page. So let's look and see how we can do that. All right, so I'm going to go back to my editor and back to our greeting component. All right, now what I can do here is replace this string with something like this. So I'm going to do a div opening and closing tag, and let's do hello world inside of here, okay? Now the other thing we can refactor here a bit is since we're using Babel, we can use ES6 arrow syntax. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to say, so I'm going to change this a little bit. Now we can also do our export separately down below the function. So I'm going to say export default greeting, and up here, oops, I'm going to make a function expression. So I'm going to say constant greeting equals, then we get rid of the function keyword. Since we're using ES6, use an arrow function here, just like that. All right, that looks good. All right, now I want us to look for a second at line 2, return div hello world. So it looks like we're returning HTML from this JavaScript function. How is that possible? Well, the trick is this is not actually HTML. This is what's called JSX, all right, which is, it may look like a templating language or HTML or XML or something like that, but it's actually an extension of the JavaScript syntax, okay? And what it allows us to do is return HTML and use JavaScript inside of it by using curly braces, okay? So we can do something like this. Let's create a name variable. All right, set it to Julia. Now we can do name inside of here like that. All right, we can basically, inside the curly braces, we can use any kind of JavaScript expression, anything that resolves to a value. All right, let's make these H1s just so they're a bit more obvious when we look at the page. So I'll do H1s. Okay, let's save that and let's just reload our page and see if this works. Aha, okay, so there's an error. React must be in scope when using JSX. So we need to pull in something from the React library. And if we go back to our app.js, we can see that we're importing React here. So we need this in order to use JSX. So let's copy this line, import React from React. And let's go ahead and paste that here on line 1 of our greeting. Now we don't need component just yet. So import React from React. Save that and let's go ahead and reload the page. And there we go. There's our H1. So basically JSX, what happens behind the scenes is there's something called react.createElement, and you can call that explicitly to create any kind of HTML element. But this is just a shorter syntax, an easier way to do it. So you can use React without using JSX, but in the real world, everybody uses JSX. It's just so much easier than calling create element everywhere. All right, so the next thing we're going to talk about here is the concept of props. Now this is very important in React.js, and props along with state is one of the places where data is going to live within your React application. Now you can think of props as sort of like a function argument, so it allows one component to pass data to another component. All right, and so let's just look at how this works here. So let's say instead of having our name hard-coded here in our greeting component, let's say that the greeting component doesn't have any idea what the name's going to be. Maybe our parent component, which is app, is going to fetch that data from a database somewhere, all right, or from a HTTP request. And so props allows the parent component, app, to pass that data down. So we can do something like this. Now this is a custom attribute on the component, and we can give it whatever name we want. In this case, we're naming it name, okay? And we're passing the value into greeting, okay? Now save that. Now from greeting, we can get rid of this variable declaration. Now all we have to do is add props as an argument to our greeting function, and we can use it right here in our curly brackets, just like this. All right. So again, the app component is responsible for setting the name, the data, and then passing it down to the child component via properties, via props. So let's save that and well, maybe we should give it a different name just so it's a little bit more obvious. All right, so let's say Sarah. That way we know if it actually worked or not. Okay, so save that and let's reload our page. And there we go. Hello world, Sarah. So just one more thing I wanted to mention about props before we move on is that props should always be considered read-only. In other words, they should never be modified after being passed into your functional component. And the idea here is to adhere as closely as possible to the principles of functional programming and to treat functional components as pure functions, or functions that don't modify their inputs, and that given the same inputs always produce the same output. This is just good coding practice and leads to more predictable, testable code and fewer bugs in the long run. All right, guys, now that we've seen how functional components work, the next thing I want to talk about is class-based components. A class component requires that we extend the React.component base class and create a render function which returns a React element. So this approach does require a bit more coding, but it also allows us to leverage a few other useful things such as lifecycle methods and state, which we'll cover shortly. Okay, so let's take a look and see what we have to do to refactor our functional component to be a class-based component. So the first thing I'm going to do is bring in component from React, because this is essentially the base class that we're going to be extending. All right. So now we can do class. We'll use the ES6 class keyword to define our class. We'll say greeting extends component. And we'll put our class body here. All right, now I'm just keeping the old code down below it for comparison's sake for now. Okay, so each class component needs to have a render function. All right, and this is what's going to be invoked anytime a change happens in the application which necessitates a re-rendering of the UI. Okay, and inside each render we need to have a return statement. Okay, and this actually specifies what HTML or what content is going to be inserted into the DOM. So one thing to take note of here is the way that we access props in a class-based component versus a functional component. So with our class-based component, we need to access it via the this keyword. Okay, so compare that to our functional component when we're passing props as an argument to the function and then referencing that argument. Here, props is a property on our class, so we have to access it via the this keyword. All right. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and delete my functional class definition here. Save the file, and let's take a look and make sure everything is still working the same. All right, there we go. All right, so that was the quick rundown on class-based components, and the next thing I'd like to talk about is state, followed by lifecycle methods, and then we'll get into a little bit of event handling. All right, so let's talk about state now. State is one of the core concepts in React. So your state is an object that contains data describing the current state of your application. So for example, in our greeting component, we can define state just like this. Now this is going to be a class property of our greeting class. So we just have to set this to an object, and then we can add any properties that would describe the state of our application inside the object body. So let's give it a username and set the value to Jane, just like that. Okay, now similarly to the way we access props, we can access state via the this keyword. So this.state, and then the property that we're after here. So this.state.username. Okay, let's save that and check our page. And there we go. Hello world Jane. You know what? I think I can get rid of the world. So let's just remove that. And hello Jane. There we go. Much better. All right. Now you may have heard that React is declarative in nature. And what this basically means is that in React we describe the way the UI should look in advance, depending on the current state of the application. Then when the state changes, the UI changes depending on what those declarations look like. So let's try a quick example of that. Okay, let's create a state property that corresponds to whether or not the user is logged in. So I'll say is logged in, and let's just set it to true for now. Now what we can do down in our render function, we can have conditional rendering based on state properties. So I'm going to say if this.state.is logged in, then we'll display the username. All right, so I'll move this return statement here. And then else, in other words, if they're not logged in, we can return a message. Let's just add a P. Please sign up or log in. Something like that. All right, so now our UI should display either one of these HTML snippets based on the isLoggedIn property. All right, so it's set to true right now. Let's save it, check our page, and basically we should see the same thing. Hello Jane, there's our user greeting. All right, now let's go back to our code editor and let's set this to false. Now we'd expect the UI to change according to how we've declared the conditions down here. So let's check again, and there we go. Please sign up or log in. So you can probably see that this is a very powerful way to have the UI display different contents based on the state. And this is really one of the core principles of React. All right, guys, so the next thing I want to talk to you about is React lifecycle methods. Now, lifecycle methods are provided by the component class, and they allow you to execute code at specific stages in the page lifecycle. All right. Now, I've copied a link here to the reactjs.org documentation regarding state and lifecycle. And by the way, as a side note, the React documentation is actually really good, so I totally recommend you guys coming here and at least going through the main concepts just to reinforce your knowledge. All right, so if we scroll down a bit, we can take a look at the two lifecycle methods that I want to talk about today. And those are component did mount and component will unmount. All right, so these are pretty self-explanatory. You can probably guess at what point they fire. So component did mount, that fires as soon as the DOM has loaded, has finished loading. So it's a great place for any kind of initialization code or any kind of HTTP requests that are necessary once the page is loaded. And component will unmount. This is kind of like your unload, which will fire right after the DOM elements have been removed from the page. So any kind of teardown code that you need to put in place, this would be a great spot for it. All right, let's go back to our code editor and let's try out component did mount. So, okay, let's say our username, let's say we're just initializing it to an empty string and we want to load it once the page loads. Let's say we're getting it from the database or some kind of service call, all right? And we'll flip this flag back to true while we're in here. All right, so what I can do is come down here below state and I can create a component did mount. It would help if I spelled it correctly. Component did mount. All right. So it's just a class property that's provided by the component base class. All right, so what we want to do here is we want to actually set the username to a specific value once the page loads. Now, going back to state for a minute, you should always remember that we should never manipulate state directly, all right? And this also goes hand in hand with principles of functional programming. We need to use what's something called set state. Set state in order to set any kind of state properties, all right? And I'll show you how that looks. So set state can take two optional arguments, state and props. So let's say you want to set the state, you want to set a state property to something depending on props that have been passed into the component. So in that case, you can use the props argument. And the state argument, this gives you the current or previous state in case you want to use that to influence whatever the new state's going to be. All right, so inside here, we're going to have an object. And inside here, we'll define whatever property we want to change. So in this case, we're changing username. And in this case, we're just going to set it to a new string. Let's say Bob. All right. So why don't we need to specify isLoggedIn or any other state properties? Well, another advantage of using set state is that it merges the previous state object, so we don't have to worry about it. We only need to specify the state property that we're interested in changing. All right. So let's save that and check our page. Oops, and something's not working, so let's go back. Any clues in? Nope. All right, let's go back to our code, and I'm sure I've just missed something obvious here. Username. I still didn't spell component right. I'm sure you guys saw that. All right, there we go. Component did mount. Let's save that and check our page again. And there we go. Hello, Bob. All right, back to the code editor. Now let's try another example. So what I want to do now is I want to add another message underneath the greeting that just tells the user how many times they visited the page. All right, so we'll add a button, and then each time the user clicks that button, we'll increment our count. All right, so this is good also. This will give me a chance to show you guys how events work in React. So first thing I want to do is add a new property to state called count, okay, and we'll initialize that to 0. All right, now let's go down to our actual render function. Now we want to render a second line here, so we can use parentheses. All right, indent that, and let's add our close parentheses. Okay, now let's add another element, and we'll say button. And let's just say click me and close tag button. Okay. All right, I'll get rid of this semicolon here. What doesn't it like here? Okay. This is another good point to bring up. So the thing about the return statement is in React, whatever the content is in your return statement, it needs to have one parent element. So here I have two parent elements, right? Or two elements side by side. So one thing I can do is just add a div here, all right? And then closing div, that should satisfy that error, okay? But the problem with this is maybe I don't want an extra div in my DOM just to satisfy some constraint in React. So what I can do is I can use something called React fragments. And a React fragment, and I'll just import it here. This is part of the React library. Fragment. So a fragment is an element that exists in my React code, but it will not actually be output to the DOM. So this is really useful for cases like this where I can't type and talk at the same time. Fragment, there we go. Really useful for cases like these where you need some kind of wrapper element, but you don't necessarily want that in the DOM because it would just cause bloat. All right, so there we go. We can wrap it in a fragment element. Okay, so back to the task at hand. Now I want to add an onClick. Okay, equals, and don't forget to use curly braces here. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to define a click handler under the class component. All right, and so we'll just reference that here, although we haven't created it yet. But we'll use this dot handle click. All right, now let's go ahead and create that handle click function. So we'll just go right above component did mount, and we'll say handle click. All right. Now for the function of the body, we'll use this dot set state. Okay, and we'll say state props fat arrow. And this time we want to increment the count. So we'll say count. So we can say state.count, because that'll give us the current or previous count. And I'm just going to say +1. All right. So now when the user clicks on this button, it'll increment the state.count property. And oh, we have to have our message. I forgot about that. So let's just put a little paragraph tag here. And we'll say, you have visited this site this.state.count times. All right. Oh, and close. Don't forget to close your p tag. I'm probably the only one who forgot that. Okay, now let's save this and take a look at the page. Failed to compile button is not defined. Okay, what have I done wrong here? Oh, you know what? This needs to be lowercase because it's not a React element. It's just an HTML element. There we go. Let's try that again. All right, so here's our button. Now let's try to click it. Aha, now it's not working. Do you guys know why this is not working? So what's going on here is that this, which we're intending to point to the actual class, the greeting class, is actually now bound to the handle click function, okay? So we've lost the context, the original context that we intended for this. Luckily, there's an easy fix for this in the form of arrow functions. So if we just go back to our code, Since ES6 arrow functions have a lexical this, meaning it doesn't bind this to the actual function, it preserves the original context. So by simply reformatting our function here to use the fat arrow, this should solve the problem. So let's save this and let's try it again. All right, click me, and there we go. So our visit count is being incremented as we intended. All right, guys, so that's going to do it for this lesson. So now that we've got a basic understanding of different component types, props, state, events, and lifecycle methods, we're in a great position to start coding our simple weather app, where we'll put all these concepts into play and see how they work in a more substantial context. So thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.